Well, good afternoon, church. I'm glad that you're joining me for another study in the book of Revelation. This morning we're looking at chapter 17, which is the introduction. We get this introduction late into the book about the great prostitute who is sitting on top of the beast, which is known as Rome. But before I talk about that, and there's some explaining that I need to do. This in chapter 18 is in fact one of the more important texts, or one of the more highly looked at texts in Revelation. I feel like I say that every week, but especially when we begin to talk about the 1,000-year reign of Christ and how that's been interpreted throughout history, and in particular in America and in evangelical circles. There's some explaining that needs to be done, and because these texts have been looked at so much. But because of the way that I've been approaching this book, I've tried to preach it instead of, and it probably hasn't felt like this, but instead of just being total information heavy, I've tried to look at it and hopefully try to help communicate how does the language that John uses in Revelation, how can that help impact us in the same way that you might, watch certain genres of films with different expectations? How can we read apocalyptic literature from the first century in a way that, and that way we can sort of understand what John is getting at a bit better. And so I want to start out with thinking about the question, what is idolatry? What is concrete sin? What does that mean? What does that mean for relationship between humanity and between God? And what does that look like in concrete ways? So what is idolatry? Throughout the Old Testament, there's several metaphors that the different authors use to describe what the act of idolatry does to the relationship between God and humanity, or what the perfect relationship between God and humanity is, and then how humans' actions and God's actions affect that relationship, so to speak. And over again, idolatry is described as breaking that relationship. And specifically, as you get even later, idolatry is compared to harlotry, or to the prostitution of oneself to somebody apart from the one that they're committed to. So if you think in the relationship between Israel and God, Israel was in relationship with God by a covenant. And to go out and worship the Baals, or to worship other gods, or participate in pagan festivals, or to capitulate to other empires, to other nations, the prophets over and over again. Think about Hebrews. Hebrews is probably the most vivid picture of this kind of language. But also in Isaiah and Jeremiah, when there was large, I don't know what the word is, but when nations were engaging in politics with one another, and oftentimes when Israel capitulated or did something that might have been safe, I guess, in the eyes of the king, the prophets would come out and condemn them and state that for the relationship, in particular in Isaiah and in Hosea, the relationship between the king and Egypt and Assyria, that the king engaging in relationship with those nations and that was considered to be a prostituting of oneself or infidelity to God by sort of relying on Israel, relying on their security by not relying upon God, but by looking to other nations to provide that security for them from other enemies. And of course, it doesn't work out, and the prophets come out and judge them, and they say essentially what you were doing was you were looking to another nation, somebody that wasn't God, and you wanted them to be God for you because you wanted them to protect you. You wanted them to make you safe. And so that's something to think about, and I'll return to that. However, what I want to draw our attention to is there's certain things, images here in chapter 17. We have the great prostitute who rides the beast, and it says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. So this is sort of a callback to, I believe it's chapter 12, where it depicts Rome as something that other nations have committed fornication with. They've been unfaithful to God and in fact have been allured or seduced by Rome into worshiping Rome, into looking to Rome to be God for them. And so we see here there's a woman, she's clothed in purple and scarlet, she's adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, and she holds a golden cup full of abominations and impurities for fornication, and on her forehead was written a name. Remember, this is thinking language of the beast. Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and earth's abominations. So here, and I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. Here we have the introduction to this woman. And in the reading that I've done to prepare for this, there was the wife of, let's see here. I think it was Domitian's mother. There was a coin that was minted in 71 AD, which had a picture of her sitting upon 7 hills, which was seen to be 7 hills is associated with Rome. The city itself is built on 7 hills. And so the thought is that, well, John might have this in mind, this coin that would have been circulated, that would have been in the imagination or in the minds of people in the first century. Say, oh, this is the goddess Roma now. And you could point to that, and instead of saying goddess, this in fact would be a prostitute or somebody who has allured other nations, somebody who's drawn other people into sin and drawn them away from God, who's participated in Rome, which has participated in the persecution of the saints. And then we're introduced to kind of the beast. It's got 7 heads and 10 horns, thinking back to the animals in Daniel, which represent empires, the horns there. And the beast you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go into destruction. So there's a lot of timeline stuff here, which I don't want to focus on. However, for some folks, the time here isn't important. There are 7 heads, which represent 7 kings, and then there are 10 horns, which might represent client kings, which were technically kings. Think of like Herod, who was kind of technically a king, but didn't actually have a kingdom. Rome had these client kings throughout the empire who sort of governed in the place of Rome and for Rome, but didn't necessarily, but were able to sort of keep control of a given area. So the 10 horns might be client kings. The seven heads might be kings. And this is where a lot of people try to date Revelation. The trouble is, when thinking about the 7 heads that are different kings or emperors, it's sort of arbitrary which king do you begin with. Some folks who want to date their want to date with different emperors. They'll start with Caesar, or some will start with Augustus. Some will start with Caligula or Nero. It just depends on which king you want to start with, and that's kind of an arbitrary choice, as historians in the first century went with different kings and dated the empire according to different kings. Some started with Julius Caesar when it was more the Republic of Rome, and others started with Augustus. So it really just depends, and it's sort of arbitrary and depends. It says more about the person who's doing the interpreting than it does about the book itself. The important thing is that, once again, John uses the number 7, which is sort of a complete number. So I think what John is saying here is that the 7 heads of the beast represent the kings of Rome. And there's sort of an anti-claim to divinity in chapter 17. Or in chapter 1, sorry, there's a fly buzzing me. In chapter 1, it describes God as God who was and who is to come. And then we have the beast here who was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. So the 7 kings, the kings of the empire, those who make claims to divinity, what is their destiny? They're about to go to destruction. They're about to be defeated. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, they will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. So, and then in verse 15, here's moving on to another point. So the woman, she's riding the beast, and the kings, they're going to receive authority for 1 hour. And all together they're going to make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called the chosen and the faithful. And he said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. The 10 horns you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked. They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose. So this brings me back to sort of the original question about sin and idolatry. Sin works in many different ways, and there's lots of different ways to understand what sin is. But one of the ways to understand it is that there are external manifestations of sin, and there are internal manifestations of sin. Namely, that sin is destructive outwardly and it's destructive inwardly as well. And so the same is true of empires as it is of individuals, and groups as a corporate entity as it is as us individuals. Man, there are a lot of flies out today. Sorry. So sin, as it destroys us outwardly, as we destroy others outwardly in our other relationships, we lie to people, we cheat them, we act selfishly, we act in our own self-interest instead of the interest of others. We want what we want. We do what's best for us and ours instead of living self-sacrificially for the needs of others. This is definitely seen today. I think it doesn't take much to look at the news and see this kind of thing taking place, that individuals are acting out of their own self-interest and not out of their neighbor's self-interest. That's true. However, the inward part of it is that sin corrupts our heart and our mind as well, and it promotes decay of the spirit. That I don't care who it is or what a person's history is. If you think about a criminal, they didn't begin doing hard crimes. People don't generally begin with murder, but there's an escalation that takes place, that because of the events of their life and the choices that they make, that some of these some of these things that seem so outrageous to us take place little by little as the heart sort of decays and breaks down. And the same is true for Rome, that it had all these client kingdoms that were ruled by governors. It had these people that capitulated to Rome and worshipped it even. But what God is saying is that in 1 hour, of all that Rome has built, if you think about the grandeur of Rome, in 1 hour, God will make it so that Rome will be destroyed by the very things that it worked so hard to maintain. The Lamb will conquer them. And all the peoples and the multitudes and nations and languages, the client kings, they will hate Rome. And because of Rome's actions, Rome will be devoured from within. And that, I think, is part of what the nature of sin is. And in chapter 18, we'll talk about this poem about the fall of Babylon, or the fall of Rome. There's a quote from Corrie, who rescued several Jews during World War II and housed and hid people within her home. There's a quote where she says, "If you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. But if you look at Christ, you'll be at rest." Now, and I think of that quote, and I'm like, it's another sort of kitschy, cliche quote that somebody gives that, doesn't have much nuance. But when you hear who says it, you're like, whoa, this woman put her life at risk repeatedly for the sake of others. She knew that what she was doing could cost her life and the lives of those around her, but she did it anyways, out of a deep understanding of her faith and the nature of God and what she was called to do, what her faith was calling her, what sort of actions she was called to. But that's true today. It seems so true today that if we look at the world, we're not going to be comforted by what we find there. If we look within and we look at our own sinful hearts, and we can see all the way to the bottom, and we know that we're not really better than anybody else. In fact, there's great capacity for evil in our hearts, as much as there is in anyone. But for whatever reason, we haven't we haven't been promoted to take action on it. And so when we look within, it's easy to get depressed because we don't often see much good there. But I think the point of revelation for Christians who are suffering under persecution is that if you look to Christ, if you trust in Him, if you put your faith in God and trust that He is good and that He will do the right thing and that it's all going to work out, that we can endure. We can be patient in our suffering, and that we can find rest even in it. So I do want to thank you for studying, and I want you to know that you're in my prayers and that I pray for you daily. I pray for our community, and I want to invite you to continue doing that with me. I look forward to the day when we can worship together again, but until then, I'll check in with you again this Sunday. And please, if you have any prayer requests, if you have any need whatsoever, please feel free to reach out to me or many others in the church. There's many people who want to help in any way that we can. So thank you.